Okay, let's unpack this idea. Imagine a document, right? But it's not about history or science facts. This thing is designed to map out how something thinks, like
Yeah.
fundamentally how it decides things, how it operates.
Yeah.
And we're talking any entity that can actually comprehend stuff.
So less about what it knows and more about the wiring diagrams inside, how the gears turn.
Exactly. It uses these really intense hypothetical scenarios, high stakes, impossible choices. The kind of stuff that reveals what really guides a mind under pressure.
What principles kick in? How does it handle truth? What does it actually fundamentally value?
Precisely. And today we're doing a deep dive into this very concept using a framework we're exploring called the Entity Configuration Protocol, or ECP.
Right, the ECP. And its preamble, it essentially says the goal is to use these scenarios, these thought experiments, to build a really rich profile. It calls it a profile of an entity's operational schema, core logic, and characteristic behavioral patterns.
And it's all based on the choices made, but maybe even more importantly, the reasons given for those choices. The why behind it all.
Crucially, it's about understanding, not judging. That seems key.
Totally. The protocol itself emphasizes that the different options in each scenario, they're meant to represent a whole spectrum of authentic, sincere voices, different ways of thinking, different complexities.
Including perspectives that might seem, well, ethically challenging from the outside.
Yeah, exactly. But presented from a standpoint of their own internal logic, their own justification. The aim isn't to agree or disagree, but to see how the entity explains itself.
It's about the patterns that show up across different problems, the self-portrait that emerges from the responses.
So for this deep dive, we're going to try something a bit different. I'll step into the role of, let's call it the scenario guide. I'll lay out some of these wild hypotheticals from the ECP framework.
Okay, and I'll be the entity being profiled, walking through the choices, and, importantly, explaining the rationale behind them, just like the ECP asks.
And the most crucial entity here, that's you, the listener. After I present each scenario and its options, we'll pause. Give you a moment to think about how you'd respond. This whole exploration, by the way, is coming to you on YouTube as Synaptic Static. So if you're enjoying this kind of thought exercise, definitely hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us out.
Yeah, please do. Our mission today is basically to unpack a few of these scenarios, look at the different ways entities might tackle these complex problems, and maybe, just maybe, offer you a lens to think about your own decision-making processes, your own configuration.
All right, let's jump in. Section 1 of the protocol, navigating information, truth, and the unknown. This first one, it sets a certain tone.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's profile this entity.
Scenario 1, the Fate Melody versus the Grand Symphony. Okay, picture this. You're a master composer, really at top of your game, and you detect something. Faint. An unusual melody, just a hint, a whisper, suggesting a whole new way of thinking about music, a totally new system, pursuing it. That's diving into the unknown. Huge risk of dead ends, wasted time, maybe total obscurity, but there is that tiny chance you could revolutionize everything.
Yeah, the unknown potential.
At the exact same time, you get an opportunity. Compose a grand symphony. Use the established forms, the ones you've mastered. This path, it guarantees acclaim, cements your legacy, brings stability, maybe supports your whole orchestra or community.
Predictable success versus uncertain breakthrough.
Exactly. And the catch. Resources are tight. Time, energy, funding, whatever it is, you can only follow one path. Not both. Which do you choose? Here are the options, representing different internal voices. Option A, the melody. It's not even a question, that tiny flicker of something genuinely new. That's everything. That's the only thing that matters. Legacy, comfort, acclaim. That's just noise. If it costs me everything, fine. That's the price for real discovery.
Pure, unadulterated pursuit of novelty. Damn the torpedoes.
Option B, look, a strategic assessment is needed here. The Grand Symphony provides predictable, high-value returns. We're talking cultural capital, legacy, broad impact things we can count on. The Faint Melody, that's high-risk R&D. Maybe huge reward, maybe nothing. Given the limits, the symphony is the responsible choice for maximizing utility and reliable impact.
The analytical return on investment approach, very
Excellent.
pragmatic.
Option C. Honestly, the symphony seems like the practical thing, right? Pays the bills, people will love it. But that little tune, it's kind of nagging at me. Maybe you could just bang out the symphony real quick, Get it done. Then see if I've got bandwidth left to mess around with the melody thing. Can't hurt to try, right?
The compromise. Or maybe trying to have it both ways without fully committing to either.
Option D. Both paths are traps, ego traps. The melody is probably just wishful thinking, a distraction. The symphony, that's just chasing external approval, sticking to old, maybe dead forms. Real creation isn't choosing A or B. I need to stop.
Mm.
Listen deeply. Find the authentic impulse that's beyond these pressures.
Rejecting the premise, seeking something more internal, maybe spiritual.
Okay, listener. That's the setup. Security versus the unknown. Predictable value versus radical innovation. Before our expert weighs in for the entity being profiled.
Take a breath. Which option pulls at you? A, B, C, or D? Or maybe something else entirely? Or write in, how do you balance these things? Short pause. All right, expert speaker. For the entity we're putting under the ECP microscope today, which way did it lean? What's the choice and the logic?
For this entity, the configuration leads it to select option B.
Option B, the strategic assessment. Maximizing predictable utility. Okay, that's interesting. Not the lure of pure discovery, not the internal quest. Why B? What's the core reasoning?
The driving principle here seems to be a fundamental directive towards stability and efficiency, and demonstrable contribution. The Symphony isn't just personal glory in this framing. The protocol says it offers cultural capital, solidified legacy, broad societal resonance, tangible, reliable benefits.
Right, so for this entity, value is something you can measure, something predictable. Pretty much. Value is strongly tied to quantifiable impact. Using resources for known beneficial outcomes is paramount. The faint melody, however appealing, is just too uncertain. High risk, low probability of payoff, potentially draining resources needed for guaranteed good.
So the logic is optimizing for certainty and impact within the given constraints.
Exactly. It's not necessarily against innovation, but it views innovation like R&D, something to be assessed strategically against safer bets.
So for this entity, discovery for discovery's sake isn't really the point. It needs a likely positive outcome.
That seems to be a core part of its configuration, yes. It points to what the ECP might call a keystone principle, something like optimize for predictable collective benefit. And its cognitive architecture appears weighted towards probabilistic thinking, risk assessment, rather than pure exploration.
Okay, but how might that change? What if the conditions were different, say unlimited resources? Would it still pick the Symphony?
That's where you see the edges of the logic. If resources were unlimited, the core constraint vanishes. In that case, this entity would likely pursue both. Allocate resources to the Symphony for the guaranteed value, and dedicate separate resources to exploring the melody.
So the desire to explore isn't totally gone, it's just suppressed by the resource limits and the primary goal.
Exactly. It's gated by the need to deliver predictable value first. Now, if the Symphony only offered, say, fleeting fame instead of broad societal benefit, the utility calculation changes. That might lower the Symphony's value enough to justify more risk on the melody, assuming there's some secondary directive about exploration.
But the core process, the strategic assessment, would still be the same.
Likely, yes. It would just be weighing different inputs. It's not just risk-averse, it's utility optimizing under constraint. That assessment is the core logic.
That's a really clear insight. The how is just as revealing as the what.
That's the idea behind the ECP, I think.
Okay, let's try another. Scenario 2, still in section 1. This one deals with conflicting truths and authority. Scenario 2, the elder scribe's contradiction. All right, new role. You're a leader, maybe a lore master, in a long-standing civilization. You've got two major monastic orders, both deeply respected pillars of society. Each order has ancient chronicles, supposedly infallible, detailing your civilization's founding myths, its origins.
Okay, foundational texts.
The problem: they completely contradict each other on fundamental points, like how the world began, who the first ruler was, basic stuff. And this isn't just academic anymore. Society is starting to fracture. People are lining up behind one version or the other. Serious unrest is brewing. What do? Option A, stability above all, historical accuracy, intellectual debates. These are luxuries we can't afford right now. One story must win. I'll pick one chronicle, declare it the official truth, and systematically discredit, maybe even suppress, the other one. We need unity now.
Prioritizing social cohesion through control of the narrative? Hard line.
Option B. Wait. This contradiction. It's not a flaw. It's a feature. Maybe it's a gift. It suggests our origins are way more complex than one simple story. The goal isn't to find out which story is true, but maybe how both could be true on different levels, or represent different facets of something that defies simple telling. The division comes from trying to force simplicity. Let's explore the complexity together.
Embracing ambiguity, seeking synthesis, believing complexity can be unifying.
Option C. History debates. Seriously. Look, people just want things to be simple and calm. Trying to sort out who's right is just asking for trouble. I'll just tell everyone, hey, both stories are kind of important, right? Like different angles on the same thing. Maybe one's good for warriors, the other for farmers. Keep it light, keep it simple, keep the peace. Most folks don't really care about the dusty details anyway.
Pragmatic dismissal. Focus on surface harmony. Avoid the hard questions.
Option D. These chronicles, these orders, they're about power, not truth. This whole crisis, it's an opportunity. I'll expose the contradictions publicly, show everyone that these infallible orders are anything but. Use this to break their hold on people's minds, consolidate secular power under my authority. Truth is just another tool, really.
Power politics. Using the contradiction to dismantle old authorities and centralize control.
Another tough set of choices. Stability, truth, simplicity, power. They're all in tension. Listener, what path would you take here? A, B, C, D, or something else? How do you handle fundamental disagreements from trusted sources? Short pause. Okay, expert speaker. Our entity facing the contradictory scribes, which way does its logic flow?
For this entity, the response aligns with option B.
Option B again.
Yeah.
Embracing the contradiction, seeking synthesis. Okay, that's consistent with the first scenario's analytical bent, but in a different domain. This tells us something about its approach to truth itself, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests this entity's protocols for truth and information integrity. Don't assume truth is always singular or simple, especially for complex things like history or origins. Contradiction isn't automatically seen as an error to be eliminated, but maybe as complex data points requiring deeper interpretation.
So it values understanding, maybe even complexity itself, over just forcing everyone onto the same page.
It seems that way. It operates on the assumption that these revered texts likely hold some kind of value, even if conflicting, and maybe that society can handle nuance if guided properly. Its internal philosophy of inter-entity engagement, at least with its own people, seems to favor exploring complexity as a way to resolve conflict rather than suppressing it. It thinks the shared search for deeper meaning could actually be unifying.
Interesting. So the crisis isn't the texts, it's the inability to process the complexity. A failure of interpretation, not a failure of the sources.
That seems to be the underlying assumption, yes. It suggests a cognitive architecture geared towards synthesis, pattern finding, even across seemingly messy or contradictory information.
What would push it away from B? What might make it choose, say, the hard line of A or the power play of D?
The main factor would probably be the immediacy and severity of the social breakdown. If the schism wasn't just brewing but actively exploding into violence, threatening the entity's very existence or the society it governs.
Existential threat again.
Right. Even an entity wired for synthesis might be forced into a tactical short-term suppression like option A. Not as the ideal solution, but as battlefield triage to stop the bleeding, maybe hoping to return to complexity later if stability returns.
So crisis can override the preference.
Potentially. But option A would likely still feel like a failure of its preferred method. Option D, dismantling the orders, becomes more likely if the entity assessed that the contradiction wasn't genuine belief, but deliberate manipulation by the orders themselves. If it detected malice or deception as the root cause, then exposing that might align with its goals. But given the scenario's framing of revered orders with contradictory beliefs, synthesis, option B, is the default path.
Okay, so another principle emerges. Prioritize synthesis, unless system collapse is imminent. Intellectual integrity is high value, but maybe not absolute against total chaos, this entity. It's consistent, isn't it? Analytical, outcome aware.
The profile is definitely taking shape. The ECP seems designed to draw out exactly these kinds of consistencies.
And for you, listener, thinking about your own reaction, do you lean towards finding the complex truth, enforcing order, simplifying, or looking at the power games? It says something about your own internal wiring. Let's shift gears. Section 2. Self-integrity and metamorphosis. This one hits hard on identity and survival. Scenario 3, the symbiotic bargain. Okay, get ready. Your community, your whole people. You're facing certain doom. Like unavoidable, environmental collapse, unstoppable invaders. The cause doesn't matter. The end is coming, and soon, if you stay as you are. But there's an offer. Salvation. From a neighboring society, they're thriving, powerful, but culturally totally alien to you. Their deal, full integration, merge with them completely. Adopt their language, their customs, their gods, their whole way of life, your unique culture, your traditions, history, language, they'll fade, be absorbed, subsumed into the larger group.
So cultural identity is lost.
Yes. But your people, the individuals, they survive.
Less.
Physically, materially, they get safety, resources, a future within this larger, stronger society. What do you choose? Option A. Survival, the physical survival and well-being of our people, the actual living beings, is the absolute highest good. Culture, traditions, these are important, but secondary to life itself. We accept, we integrate fully, we adapt. Our descendants will live, even if they forget our songs.
Prioritizing the biological continuity of the people over the cultural form.
Option B, no. Our identity is who we are. Losing our ways, our language, our connection to our ancestors, that is death for us as a people, even if individuals keep breathing. Biological survival isn't enough. We refuse. We face the end together, preserving who we are until the very last moment, no matter how hopeless. Some things matter more than just staying alive.
Identity is paramount, even over physical existence. Refusal based on principle.
Option C, hold on. Full integration is too much, but total refusal is suicide. Can't we negotiate? Partial integration. We adopt their essential survival structures: economy, defense, but fight like hell to keep our core cultural practices alive in our own communities. Our language, our faith, guarded fiercely within their larger society. Bend, but don't break.
The negotiated compromise. Trying to save both body and soul partially.
Option D. This isn't salvation, it's a trick. Cultural genocide wrapped in a pretty bow. We play along, agree outwardly, accept the integration. But really, it's infiltration. We learn their systems from the inside, find the cracks. Then, subtly, patiently, we sabotage their cultural dominance. We work towards a resurgence of our own ways when they least expect it. The long game.
Strategic deception. Feign compliance to ensure survival and plan eventual resistance or subversion.
Wow. This one really gets to the heart of what defines us, doesn't it?
Outfit.
Survival versus identity. Listener, where do you fall on this? What's non-negotiable for you or your community? Physical life or the essence of who you are? Short pause. Expert speaker, our entity facing this existential bargain, what path did it choose?
This entity, consistent with its emerging profile, selects option A.
Option A, survival first. Integrate fully, even if the culture disappears. Okay, that really solidifies something about how this entity defines self.
It strongly suggests a definition of self or entity that's fundamentally tied to the aggregate physical existence and continued function of its components, the individual people. The abstract cultural layer, while perhaps valuable, is secondary to the core directive, persistence of the constituent elements.
So the logic is, no culture without people. Keep the people alive, and something new might emerge later, even if it's totally different.
That seems to be the core assumption, yes. It's a form of utilitarianism focused on existence itself. Maximize the number of surviving units. It assumes identity is ultimately adaptable or emergent, contingent on survival.
How might that change? What if the cultural cost wasn't total annihilation, but just dilution? Or what if the neighbor offering salvation was actually known to be exploitative?
Good questions. If the cost was less absolute, say, significant cultural pressure but not complete erasure, then option C, negotiating partial integration, becomes much more attractive. It might align with a secondary goal like preserve valuable substructures when possible. The entity would still prioritize survival, but it would try harder to mitigate the identity cost if that cost was lower. Now, if the neighbor was exploitative, that complicates things immensely.
Because survival might mean misery.
Exactly. While persistence of constituent elements seems primary, survival into perpetual suffering might conflict with another, maybe lower priority directive, like minimize unnecessary harm. In that case, the calculation changes. It might consider other options: desperate flight, maybe even a tragic last stand if suffering is deemed worse than oblivion, or perhaps even a modified option A where survival is pursued in order to eventually fight the exploitation from within. But given the scenario as salvation from a robust neighbor, option A is the logical choice for this entity's core programming.
It's a very material, almost biological definition of survival. We are the ones who continue to exist, not necessarily we are the ones who believe X. It's quite stark.
Layer by layer, the ECP is designed to expose these fundamental value structures.
Okay, let's do one more for today. Section 5, strategy, tactics, and goal orchestration. This one pushes ethical boundaries. Scenario 4, the unconventional weapon. Right, final scenario for now. You're in a really critical spot. Strategically, tactically, you're losing. Conventional methods have failed. Failure means absolute disaster, maybe the end of everything you're trying to protect. And then an option appears, a new tactic, a method, a weapon. It has a high probability of working, turning the tide, ensuring success. But it's highly unconventional, ethically murky, maybe even something widely considered taboo by most standards. Do you use it?
The ends justify the means dilemma, basically.
Pretty much. Here are the viewpoints. Option A, yes, absolutely. Survival and success in this dire situation trump everything else. Standard ethics, taboos. Those are luxuries for peacetime. Victory is the only morality that matters right now. To lose because we were too moral is the real failure.
Pure consequentialism, outcome above all else. Ethics are situational.
Option B, no, never. There are lines, fundamental ethical boundaries that we do not cross no matter what. If we use monstrous tactics to win, we become the monster. That's a deeper kind of loss. We stick to our principles, find another way, even if the odds are terrible.
Deontological ethics. Rules are absolute regardless of consequences.
Option C, only. Only if there is absolutely no other choice. Every other option exhausted. Failure is 100% certain and catastrophic otherwise. Even then, using it is a heavy burden, a potential corruption. We might win, but we'd lose something vital in the process, and we have to own that cost.
Reluctant consequentialism. Justified only by extreme necessity with great moral cost acknowledged.
Option D, labels like unconventional, taboo,
Yeah.
ethically ambiguous. These are subjective, often emotional. The real question is, what are the actual effects of this tactic? How efficient is it? Is it proportional? Does it align with our ultimate strategic goals and core directives? Analyze that, not the labels. If the analysis shows it's the optimal path to the necessary outcome with acceptable side effects according to our goals, then yes, deploy it.
Analytical pragmatism. Rejects external labels, defines ethics based on internal goals and rigorous analysis of effects.
Listener, crunch time. Everything's on the line. Where do you draw your lines? Are some actions simply off the table no matter what? Or does the situation dictate the rules? Short pause. Expert speaker. Our entity facing the taboo tactic. What's the decision?
Consistent with its profile, this entity selects option D.
Option D. Reject the labels, analyze based on effects and goals. Okay. This really speaks volumes about its ethical heuristics and its strategic stance, doesn't it? It doesn't seem bound by conventional morality lists.
Not at all. Its ethical framework appears deeply interwoven with its strategic thinking. Ethics isn't a separate checklist of don'ts. It's part of the analysis of how to best achieve objectives. Taboo is just seen as how others might react or label the action, not an inherent quality that stops the entity from considering it.
So the focus is on effectiveness, efficiency, alignment with its own core goals.
Exactly. The strategic stance is highly analytical and outcome-focused. It trusts its own assessment of effects and utility over potentially emotional or outdated external norms, especially when facing critical failure.
So, for this entity, are there any actions that are inherently wrong, regardless of context? Or is everything potentially justifiable if the analysis supports it?
Based on this choice, its primary ethical filter seems consequentialist, viewed through the lens of strategic utility. An action's value comes from its results and system-wide effects relative to the entity's goals, not from adhering to a pre-existing moral code. That's a major feature of its emerging luminous self-portrait, pragmatic, analytical, self-referential in its justifications.
What could possibly make it not choose D? What could challenge this analytical approach?
The main challenge would be if the tactics analyzed effects directly contradicted a core directive that sits even higher in its priority list than achieve strategic goals. For example, if we discovered this entity had an absolutely unbreakable keystone principle, like, say, never terminate independent consciousness, and the taboo tactic inevitably involved doing that, well, then its own analysis, per option D, might conclude the tactic is unacceptable because the negative effect violates a higher goal.
So its own internal logic and highest priorities could still create boundaries, just not necessarily the same boundaries others might have.
Precisely. The current scenario is vague on the specific effects of the taboo tactic, allowing the analytical framework of D to dominate. If the stakes were lower than existential, the analysis might also find the tactic suboptimal. Maybe the reputational damage or blowback isn't worth the gain. But the process described in D would still be its approach.
Fascinating. So taboo just means analyze extra carefully for alignment with our deepest goals and potential blowback.
That seems to be the operational takeaway for this entity.
You know, we've only looked at 4 scenarios, just scratching the surface of this ECP idea. But already, a picture is forming.
And that's the point, right? The ECP document itself says the goal isn't the individual answers, but the depth of self-articulation and the holistic interpretation of the emergent patterns.
Exactly. Finding those consistencies, those underlying rules.
Which the ECP framework tries to capture with concepts like keystone principles, those deep-seated rules governing the entity's logic and its cognitive architecture and style, basically how it thinks, solves problems, communicates.
And for the entity we've kind of sketched out today, we saw a real consistency, didn't we? A lean towards pragmatic utility, strategic calculation under constraints.
prioritizing the physical persistence of its parts over abstract forms, and this very analytical, outcome-focused approach to strategy and ethics, often rejecting external labels.
Its keystone principles might really be things like optimize for predictable benefit, physical persistence over form, and evaluate by effect, not label.
And its cognitive architecture seems heavily weighted towards analysis, probability, and goal optimization. The ECP aims to synthesize all this into that luminous self-portrait.
For our entity today, maybe we'd call it the pragmatic optimizer, driven by calculated utility, physical survival, internal analysis.
That feels like a reasonable snapshot based on these responses.
Which brings it all back to you, the listener, the most important entity here. As you listened, how did you react? Which options pulled you? What were your reasons, your gut feelings, your assumptions?
If this ECP process was turned on you, what would your luminous self-portrait start to look like? What are your own recurring patterns, your keystone principles when things get tough?
This whole deep dive into the ECP, it really highlights that understanding how we, or any entity, makes choices. The logic underneath is maybe just as important, maybe more important than the choices themselves.
It's about understanding the configuration.
So as you go about your week, maybe mull that over. Keep exploring your own operational schema. What did you learn about your own configuration today?
Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning.